Today we're going to be talking about Defender. It's a really nice side-scrolling shooter which was made by Williams in 1981. I've played the game a few times before, but it just always felt to me like I was playing Fantasy Zone. I know Defender came first, but that's just kind of the way it reminds me of, just because it's sort of like that side-scrolling shooter thing with about as much of an open world as you're going to get in the early 80s. But let's back up a little bit, and we're going to talk about Williams as a company. Williams was founded in the 1940s and was originally a pinball company. They expanded into other coin-op, like entertainment things like jukeboxes and that sort of thing. In 1973, they started making arcade games. Their first was a Pong clone, because of course it was a Pong clone, and it was called Paddleball. In the 80s, they made a bunch of really cool games like Defender, but they also made Joust and Robotron 2084. Later in the 80s, they would buy Bally Midway, and, it just kind of went on from there. Let's get back to Defender, though. Defender was released in what was called the golden age of arcade video games. This started off with Space Invaders in 1978 and went up through the mid-80s. Defender was one of Williams' best-selling arcade cabinets. During its lifetime, it sold 55,000 units, which is really crazy for an arcade game. This was one of Williams' first attempts at making something kind of unique, so they didn't want to follow the pack with all of their other games. And I think they really did when you compare Defender to a lot of the other contemporary games. So here we have the game itself, and it looks pretty good for an Atari game. It obviously would have looked a lot better in the arcades. It's a fairly simple game. You just scroll back and forth, which is something different here because this actually had a map for it. Which is kind of weird thinking about an arcade game that needed a map, but Defender made it work really well. It's actually really impressive that they were able to get this to translate to an Atari 2600, simply because you didn't see something this complex all the time with that system. Now, with this being about as open world as a 1981 game would allow, and also about as open as an Atari 2600 game would allow, it gives you a few kind of really cool things. You have a set number of enemies that you have to defeat in order to move on to the next stage. You have sort of a free-roaming way of going about it, like I've already mentioned. And you've got a variety of enemies, even with the 2600, that you have to try to take down. It's really impressive to see this, and just to see it in the arcade would probably be even better. One thing that was kind of cool with this game is you had to save people from being abducted by, I think, aliens. And with the 2600, I think they're people, but, it could be anything, to be perfectly honest. You don't need to use too much of your imagination with this, which is great, especially since with the 2600, you often had to use your imagination for everything. There were a few sequels to Defender, but since this is a 1980s game, just kind of take the word sequel with a grain of salt. The sequels were Stargate, Defender 2000, and then there was another Defender that was released in 2002. There's also a Defender 2 on the Atari 2600. I couldn't get my copy to actually work, but I do know it's on the system. I couldn't find a whole lot of information on it, though. So that's pretty much going to wrap things up, guys. I don't have any more information to really share for you. Anyway, please let me know what you think in the comments below, and have a great day, everybody.